Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into some fascinating material today, really getting into something we all have to grapple with: death.
Definitely a universal topic.
Yeah. And specifically, how we in British society, how we kind of experience and represent death in the modern world, right?
Right.
You've provided us with a bunch of different sources for this deep dive. We've got some acknowledgments from the academic world, a table of contents that gives us a little peek into funeral practices,
Yeah.
and then some really deep sections from a book that takes like a social psychology lens to look at death and how we deal with mortality.
Right.
Our mission today is to break down these sources and give you a clear picture of how our relationship with death has changed over time,
Okay.
from historical traditions all the way to how we see things today.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Sounds great. Let's do it.
Okay. So right off the bat, looking at these sources, I'm struck by just how many different fields of study are involved in understanding death. You know, you've got anthropologists, historians, psychologists, sociologists, all listed in the acknowledgments alone.
Yeah, I mean, that really tells you right away that death is not just a biological event.
Yeah.
It's something that really touches on our society and culture in really profound ways.
Absolutely.
And it requires, many different perspectives to understand it.
Totally. And even just glancing at that table of contents with its list of photographs, everything from like an interview room at a funeral parlor to a flower-covered hearse at a crematorium,
Hmm.
you immediately get this visual sense of the range of rituals and places that are part of dealing with death today.
It's a whole world.
Yeah,
It's a whole system.
it really is a whole system.
Mhm.
And one of the things that jumps out from the book early on is this idea of a quiet revolution
Yeah.
in how we think about and relate to death in like the last decade of the 20th century.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
So, like, the author's talking about a time when people are starting to live longer, and the process of dying is often becoming more drawn out.
Hmm.
And death kind of shifts from being this hidden thing, something we don't talk about, to something that's more openly discussed and even studied.
Right. It goes from being very private and almost like an unspoken rule in social science.
Yeah.
That you don't study this, you don't talk about this. And it shifts to this time when people are more willing to analyze it and talk about it.
Okay, so unpack this quiet revolution a bit more.
Sure.
Are we talking about a shift from death being a private family matter to something that's more, out in the open?
Exactly. That's the main point. It's the central theme that we're going to keep coming back to as we look through all these sources.
Sure.
The author even mentions feeling lucky to have been around to see this change happen. Their research captures this moment.
Yeah.
What are your initial thoughts on this quiet revolution idea?
It makes sense to me. As we, as a society, as people, kind of gained a little more distance from death in our daily lives, perhaps because of advancements in medicine or because we're living longer, maybe that created some space. Some space for a more analytical approach, a willingness to actually look at it instead of shying away.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. But before we go too far, I think it's worth going back in time a bit, right?
Yeah,
Let's rewind and get those historical perspectives that you mentioned.
sure.
How was death handled in the past, like way back when?
So back then, death was a much more communal event.
Hmm.
It was common for the entire family, even children, to be present at the deathbed.
Wow.
But, we shouldn't romanticize this too much.
Right.
Elias, writing back in 1985, pointed out that those deathbed scenes weren't always peaceful or full of love.
Right.
Sometimes families were, well, he said they could be scornful, brutal, and cold,
Oh, wow.
especially when maybe there were arguments about inheritance, or if someone had been sick for a really long time and it was a burden.
So death brought out a lot more than just sadness, it sounds like.
It did,
Okay, so it wasn't always this perfect, peaceful goodbye.
right?
What about women? What role did they play in these early death practices?
Traditionally, the women in the family were the ones who prepared the body for burial.
Mm-hmm.
They often had help from people in the community called layers out.
Layers out.
Yeah, and these layers out, they weren't paid with money, but with goods or services.
Interesting.
There's a really interesting account from Adams, who looked at Coventry in the period between the two world wars.
Okay.
This is in 1993. And she found that caring for the dead wasn't so much about family ties or, being a man's job.
Right.
It was more like this informal system of support that was organized by women.
Hmm.
This was mostly because of the economic hardship they were all facing.
Yeah.
There wasn't much public welfare.
Mm.
And they had this really strong need to ensure everyone was treated with dignity, even in death.
Right.
The layer out was a skilled individual. They would adapt to the needs of each family. It's really different from the more standardized procedures we see later.
That's a great point. So a very community-based, female-led system driven by circumstance.
Yes, exactly.
Now, I imagine the actual funeral experience varied wildly based on, your social standing.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The contrast was stark.
Yeah.
For those living in poverty, the burial was often very basic, even unceremonious.
Right.
Sometimes they were buried in communal graves on the outskirts of the graveyard.
Oh, wow.
But on the other end of the spectrum, wealthy aristocratic families would spend a fortune on what were called heraldic funerals.
Heraldic funerals.
Yeah, these were very elaborate, meticulously planned events, huge public displays.
So we're talking pauper's grave versus aristocratic spectacle.
Exactly.
Quite a range. But beyond just the display of wealth, what was the point of these early funeral rituals?
Well, even with all the extravagance at the higher end, these rituals served a fundamental purpose.
Mm-hmm.
They marked the transition from the world of the living to the world of the dead.
Right.
Almost every aspect was symbolic,
Okay.
often tied to spiritual beliefs or superstitions.
Mm.
Richardson, in 1988, talked about how noisy wakes were thought to ward off evil spirits.
Oh, interesting.
Things like opening windows and doors were meant to allow the soul to escape.
Yeah.
And then all these other customs, stopping clocks, covering mirrors, putting out fires,
Wow.
they were all loaded with symbolic meaning at the moment of death.
Yeah.
So these funerals weren't just about one thing. They weren't just about appeasing spirits.
Right.
They were also about redistributing possessions, changing social roles, even redistributing status within the community.
So dealing with the spiritual and the social impact of death all at once. Okay, so from these really, deeply symbolic and community-based practices, let's shift to something that starts to become more prominent.
Okay.
The rise of professionals and the commercialization of death.
Mm-hmm.
When do we see this starting to happen?
One major turning point was the public outcry over body snatching.
Body snatching.
Yeah. This led to the Anatomy Act of 1832.
Hmm.
There was this infamous case of Burke and Hare in Edinburgh. They were actually murdering people to provide bodies for medical schools.
Oh, wow. That's dark.
It was really gruesome. And this caused a huge public outcry. There was even a government report suggesting they should just dissect the bodies of the poor, but people were horrified by that idea.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Richardson talks about how the working class, fearing they would end up on a dissecting table, started setting up these burial societies.
Burial society.
Yeah, members would pay into a fund so they could be sure they'd get a proper funeral.
So it was about ensuring a dignified burial?
Yes, and it shows how important that became to them. What's interesting is that over time, as the benefits of medical science became clearer, people started to accept dissection more.
Mm-hmm.
And now, the bodies used for medical study mostly come from people who donate their bodies willingly.
That's quite a shift. So a pretty grim chapter in history actually pushed people to fight for a dignified burial.
It did.
And how did this all tie into the professionalization of death practices?
Well, as society became maybe a bit squeamish about the practicalities of death, especially the wealthier families, they started turning to male professionals to handle preparing the body.
So moving away from that more intimate, family-led approach?
Right. Morley, back in 1971, supported this idea.
Mm-hmm.
And while these informal, community-based practices continued for longer in working-class areas, as Adams' research showed, the general trend was toward professionals taking over.
I see.
Another example is the Midwives Act of 1902. This shows a similar shift toward professional oversight, but in childbirth. Richardson argues that this increasing use of death work professionals was like, commerce invading this rite of passage.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually lengthened the time between death and burial because there were all these new roles and procedures.
It's interesting, isn't it? As death moved out of the hands of the family, the business side inevitably grew.
It did.
Now, another big challenge that emerges is what your sources call the crisis of disposal. What was going on there?
So basically, you had these huge cities growing rapidly.
Right.
And people were living in overcrowded, often unsanitary conditions, especially the working class.
Yeah.
This led to very high death rates.
Yeah.
And pretty soon, the urban graveyards couldn't handle all the bodies.
Overflowing graveyards.
Yeah. And this was a serious public health risk. The Chadwick Report in the 1830s exposed how terrible the conditions were in London's churchyards.
Hmm.
Porter quotes Chadwick describing them as, let me see, masses of corruption.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah, not pleasant. And then the cholera outbreak in 1831, which killed thousands of people, made the crisis even worse.
A truly dire situation.
It was.
So what was the solution to this overflowing graveyard problem?
At first, cremation wasn't very common at all. In 1939, it was only used in less than 4% of funerals.
Wow, really?
Yeah. But by the early 1950s, local authorities realized that maintaining cemeteries was becoming way too expensive.
I see.
They were running out of space, and new land was expensive.
Yeah,
So to make things cheaper, they started building crematoria and kept the fees low.
okay.
And this worked. By the 1960s, half the population was choosing cremation.
Hmm.
And today, it's around 70%.
Wow. So it wasn't a sudden change in beliefs. It was a more practical response to this, like, very real problem.
Exactly.
Now, another big idea that comes up is this thing called social representations theory.
Right.
And it seems to be a key way of understanding how we think about death.
It is. It's basically about how we, as a society, collectively make sense of the world around us. All those big ideas.
Okay. So, like, the shared understandings that we develop about complex topics through our interactions.
Exactly. You explained it perfectly.
All right, good. Now, the book mentions Wundt, who's considered the founder of experimental psychology.
Mm.
But he also developed this thing called Volcker psychology, right?
Yes, which is essentially the study of things like culture and language, those collective phenomena.
Okay.
Wundt argues that although both of these aspects of Wundt's work came to North America, it was the experimental psychology that became dominant.
Right.
So psychology really started to focus on the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes those social aspects were neglected.
Okay, so this tension between the individual and the collective is important here.
It is.
Now, how does Moscovici fit into this?
Moscovici is a really important figure in social representations theory. He initially suggested that social representations are how complex knowledge, often scientific knowledge, gets translated and simplified, and then it spreads into everyday common sense. This happens through things like the media.
So, like, how these big, complicated ideas become part of our everyday thinking as a society.
Exactly. But while his initial idea of a strict divide between scientific and common sense knowledge was debated, his 1976 study of how psychoanalytic thought was understood in French society is a really good example of this approach.
So it's about how these big, sometimes abstract ideas end up shaping how we think and talk about things in our everyday lives.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, but I noticed the book also critiques Moscovici's views on rituals and myths.
You're right. The author suggests that while Moscovici brought science into the realm of social psychology, he might have missed the importance of myths and rituals in that process.
Interesting.
Moscovici seemed to think that the modern Western world didn't have real myths anymore. And this led to rituals becoming kind of empty or routine. They've lost their deeper meaning.
Yeah, I can see that.
He said, ritual without myth is partial, truncated.
That's a powerful point. So how does this all connect to Durkheim's ideas?
Well, Durkheim, another important sociologist, made this distinction between collective representations and individual representations. And this kind of caused a split between sociology and psychology. Moscovici's concept of social representations was partly an attempt to bridge that gap.
Okay.
He wanted to move beyond just individual attitudes and opinions.
Right.
To look at more dynamic shared understandings, especially in relation to science and mass media. Bosgordy argues that Moscovici called it social rather than collective, like Durkheim, to set it apart from individualistic ideas.
Okay.
Interestingly, the book also suggests that with globalization, we might see those collective representations becoming more important again.
That's fascinating. It seems like this theory gives us a good way to think about how we form and change our shared understanding of death.
It does.
Now, let's get away from the theory for a bit.
Right.
The book also talks about the researcher's experience of actually researching death in contemporary society.
Yeah.
What were some of the challenges they faced?
Well, the author reflects on how hard it was to research such a sensitive topic.
Yeah.
They talk about feeling self-conscious, having doubts, the usual research anxieties, but amplified because of the subject matter. They describe the initial field work as really confusing and challenging.
I can imagine.
But one really important point they make is about the role of the pilot study.
Okay.
In this case, The pilot study really changed the course of the research.
Hmm.
It moved the focus away from grief outcomes, which was the initial idea, to a broader exploration of the whole social experience of bereavement.
So their initial assumptions were challenged by actually being in the field, talking to people?
Yes, exactly. It was the real-world experience that shifted the focus.
And what about the methods they used in the main study? What did that look like?
It involved spending time in what they called death sites, places like hospitals, funeral parlors, crematoria, and observing what was happening.
Hmm.
This is known as participant observation.
Okay.
They also did in-depth interviews with bereaved women to understand their experiences.
So trying to get those personal perspectives.
Yes. And all throughout, they took detailed field notes,
Right.
noting not just the objective things that were happening, but also their own feelings and impressions.
It sounds emotionally intense being immersed in these spaces.
I definitely was.
Now, what about the theoretical frameworks, the ideas that help guide this work?
Well, the research drew on a lot of different ideas from both anthropology and sociology.
Okay.
From anthropology,
Mm.
thinkers like Durkheim, Hertz, Van Gennep, and Douglas helped them understand things like how death can disrupt the social order,
Mm-hmm.
how we react to the dead body is something that's, not easily categorized,
Yeah.
and then the whole symbolic meaning behind those death rituals. From sociology, Goffman's work was really helpful in analyzing how the professionals in the death industry perform their roles.
That's interesting.
And, of course, Moscovici's social representations theory helped them explore how our ideas about death shape and are shaped by the practices we have around death.
Okay.
Things like the concept of a good death or the practice of embalming.
Bringing it all together. That's fascinating how these different lenses can help us understand something so complex.
They do.
Now, what about the practicalities of getting access to these research sites?
Well, the researcher mostly used formal methods, writing letters, making applications.
So going through the official channels?
Yeah, to the people in charge at the funeral homes and hospitals.
Okay.
Sometimes this made them feel like a secretary because of all the paperwork and permissions.
Bureaucracy, even in researching bureaucracy.
Right, exactly.
And you mentioned the term death work professional earlier.
Yes.
Who exactly does that include?
It refers to anyone involved in the different stages of death, from the hospital staff to the people who register deaths officially, the coroners who investigate certain deaths, and the funeral directors.
Right, like a whole network of professionals.
Yeah, the book calls them a structured group with specific responsibilities.
Okay.
Duties and rights related to, determining the cause of death, reporting it, arranging for the body.
A lot of different roles.
Yeah.
And where did the researcher fit into all of this?
Well, for the most part, they took on the role of an observer as participant,
Okay.
which means they weren't just passively watching. They were conducting interviews, having conversations, sometimes even offering help, although not very often.
Mm-hmm.
It was about finding that balance between staying neutral and also being approachable,
Right.
building relationships so they could get real insights into what they called the worlds of death.
Now, let's move on to another big theme that comes up, the medicalization of death and dying.
Okay.
How has modern medicine changed our relationship with death?
Well, the book argues that because modern medicine is so focused on curing illness, this has led to something they call the industrialization of disease management and death control.
Okay.
Some argue that medical practice is fundamentally about always trying to cure, to keep fighting against disease.
Right.
Because of that, the conversations around dying often focus on battling illness, and the language we use is all about survival.
So maybe we end up avoiding the reality of death a bit.
Right, it can become less visible. One writer even called it the deconstruction of mortality.
It's understandable that we want to fight death,
Of course.
but it's interesting to think about how that might unintentionally obscure its inevitability.
Yeah, I think that's an important point.
Now, the book also mentions the hospice movement
Right.
as offering a different approach.
Okay.
Can you talk about that a bit more?
The hospice movement really started gaining momentum in the 1960s, and it offers this really important alternative to that purely medical model, especially for people who are dying from cancer.
Okay.
There's an argument that cancer deaths, which often affect younger people and can be these long and unpredictable illnesses, they highlighted the limitations of just the medical approach
Yeah,
and showed that there was a need for something else.
something more holistic.
Exactly. So the core principles of the hospice movement are about providing this kind of holistic care. It's not just about the disease. It's about the whole person.
Right.
It's about involving teams of specialists.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about really including the patient's family in the care.
And, focusing on their emotional needs as well.
Right, addressing those fears and anxieties in a supportive environment.
Yeah.
However, the book does point out that as hospice organizations get bigger, they can struggle to keep those core values.
Because of bureaucracy and internal hierarchies.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so it's not a perfect system, but it definitely offers a really valuable contrast to that clinical experience of death in a hospital. Now, what about the people who are actually facing death? Were there any examples of individuals actively taking part in shaping their own dying process?
There were. It was interesting. Some of the people in this study, particularly those who were middle class, actually sought out information about their dying process and wanted to be involved in decisions.
Really?
Yeah. For example, one man's wife described how he consulted a friend who was a cancer specialist to understand his prognosis.
Okay.
Another man had a long conversation with a doctor friend to get a clearer picture of what would happen as his illness progressed.
Hmm.
These individuals really wanted to be involved in decisions about things like pain management, and they wanted to put their affairs in order.
So they were trying to, maintain some control.
Yes, they wanted to stay mentally clear as long as they could.
Right.
And then when they became too ill, their wives often took on that role, carefully weighing up the pros and cons of medical interventions.
That's empowering.
It is. It really gave the researcher a sense that these families were trying to hold on to some agency, even in the face of death.
And that ties back to that idea of the good death, right?
It does.
The book also mentions Kubler-Ross's stages of dying.
Right, the famous 5 stages.
Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Yeah, a very influential model.
What perspective did the book offer on that?
While acknowledging how influential that model has been, the book also points out some of the criticisms.
Okay.
For instance, some argue that presenting dying as this neat step-by-step process can actually be problematic. Because for people whose experience doesn't fit that pattern, it can make them feel like they're not grieving or dying correctly.
Right, like you're doing it wrong.
Exactly. And the truth is that dying is often a much more complex and unpredictable emotional experience.
So no neat boxes.
No neat boxes.
What else does the book explore about the medical side of death?
Well, it talks about the role of hospital chaplains.
Okay.
The people who provide spiritual support.
Right.
And it mentions the potential for tension between their focus on the patient's spiritual well-being and the medical model, which is so focused on the physical cure.
Interesting.
There are also discussions about the policies on whether relatives can be present during resuscitation attempts.
Oh, wow.
There's a move to rethink the old idea of excluding family members.
Yeah, that's a really sensitive area.
It is. And the book talks about death in intensive care as almost a new kind of ritual in our technologically advanced world. Because the dying person can sometimes seem more like, just an object hooked up to machines.
Right.
It also highlights that really difficult process of asking families for organ donation.
Yeah.
Because for many, that can be the first time they truly accept the death.
Wow.
And then it's further complicated by, the timing of when life support is switched off.
Right.
Even something as simple as leaving the hospital after a death can be really difficult.
Yeah, it's that feeling of being completely redundant, like useless. Almost like you're, tainted by death.
Exactly. And while dying at home can mean more family involvement, it can also be incredibly demanding if there isn't enough support.
Right. A lot to think about.
There is. And of course, certain deaths are handled differently.
Right, because they involve the police and the coroner.
Yes, there's a whole other set of bureaucratic procedures.
Yeah.
And the coroner's views on things like gender roles and identifying a body, those are all factors.
It's a really detailed look at the medical world surrounding death.
It is.
From the intense efforts to prolong life to those really sensitive moments for the people left behind.
Yeah, I think it captures that well.
Let's move on to what the book calls the bureaucracy of death.
Okay.
What are the key administrative processes that people have to navigate?
Well, in cases of sudden, unclear, or suspicious deaths, the coroner's office plays a big role.
Right.
The coroner has a lot of legal authority over the body in those situations.
Okay.
Within hospitals, you've got these patient's affairs officers. They act as a bridge between the medical side and the registrar's office.
Which is responsible for officially recording deaths.
Exactly. They handle things like returning belongings and processing death certificates.
And, registering the death is something every family has to do.
Yes, they need to do that to get the official death certificate, which is important for dealing with the deceased's estate and all that.
Right.
But the experience can be really impersonal.
Yeah.
It can feel quite undignified, especially when people are already grieving.
Right. Just another hurdle to overcome.
Exactly.
Okay, now the book also looks at the funeral industry, and specifically commerce and ritual.
hmm
How does the business side of things intersect with the rituals of death?
Well, the book points out that anyone arranging a funeral essentially becomes a consumer,
Right.
and they're operating within a profit-driven industry.
Yeah.
You've got funeral directors, florists, manufacturers of coffins, headstones, all that.
Right.
Now, while acknowledging that many people working in the industry are very caring and compassionate, the fundamental motivation is still profit.
Right. It's a business.
It is. And that's different from the generally non-commercial involvement of medical and administrative staff.
Okay.
So there's that tension.
And the funeral director seems to be at the heart of this connection between business and ritual.
They do.
How does the book portray their role?
Well, despite sometimes being portrayed negatively in the media, the research found that bereaved people generally had very positive views of funeral directors.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they described them as thoughtful, kind, really helpful in coordinating everything and organizing the funeral.
So a very practical but also compassionate role.
Yes, and this aligns with research that's been done in the U.S. as well.
Hmm.
The use of horse-drawn hearses is mentioned as something that reflects this theme of traditional values.
Okay, yeah, I can see that.
And while funerals can be really expensive, the book questions whether this means funeral directors are exploiting people.
Mm-hmm.
It points out that there are a lot of overhead costs involved in running a funeral business.
Right.
And it suggests that hard sell tactics aren't usually a good idea because of the way payments are often structured.
So it's more nuanced than just accusing them of being greedy.
Yes, it's much more complex than that.
Now, what about the funeral parlor itself?
Funeral parlors often try to create this traditional and comforting atmosphere
Okay.
with older furniture, that kind of decor.
Right, like a sense of familiarity.
Yeah, like stability, although sometimes it can feel a bit dated.
Right.
They're designed to offer privacy for families while they make arrangements.
Okay.
While funeral directors sometimes visit people at home, most often people come to the parlor,
Hmm.
and they're often greeted by, a formally dressed director behind a big desk.
Setting the tone.
Right. And you'll often see those certificates of competence on display.
Showing their credentials.
Exactly, emphasizing that professionalism.
Mm.
Arranging a date for the funeral can be tricky because of the availability of crematoria and cemeteries. But the funeral directors usually handle all that behind the scenes.
So they're really managing a lot of logistics.
They are.
Now, the book also delves into some of the more practical, less visible aspects of the funeral process,